97-year-old veteran eats alone every day, until owner realized something's off. The little diner on Maple Street was nothing fancy, just a cozy, family-run spot with checkered tablecloths and the faint aroma of coffee and sizzling bacon hanging in the air. It wasn't the kind of place that made headlines, nor was it one where people expected to witness anything extraordinary. But to Jake Carter, the owner, it was everything. Every morning, he'd wipe down the counters, flip the sign to "Open," and welcome the usual faces: truck drivers grabbing a quick bite, office workers in a hurry, and elderly couples enjoying slow breakfasts. Yet among them, there was one man who never changed: Walter Hughes. Jake had been seeing him for years, a 97-year-old veteran who ate alone every single day. Walter's presence was predictable. He would shuffle in at exactly 8:30 a.m., always wearing the same brown trench coat and polished shoes that had long outlived their shine. His frail hands trembled slightly as he pulled out a chair in the far right corner, the one facing the window. And without fail, he'd order the same thing: 1 meatloaf, mashed potatoes, no gravy. A side of cornbread and black coffee. Never a word more. He ate slowly, carefully, as if savoring each bite. But what struck Jake the most wasn't the routine, it was the way Walter sat. He never truly looked alone. His posture was always slightly turned, as if someone sat across from him. Sometimes, his lips moved faintly, barely a whisper, like he was in conversation with someone unseen. But no one was ever there. At first, Jake dismissed it as the harmless habits of an old man lost in memory. But as the weeks stretched into months, something gnawed at him. Why did Walter never change his order? Why that exact time? Why did he look like he was waiting for someone who never arrived? Then came the stormy morning that changed everything. It was a rare, thunderous morning in late October, and the diner was quieter than usual. The rain came down in thick sheets, rattling against the window panes. Most customers had chosen to stay home, but at 8:30 a.m. sharp, Walter still arrived, his coat soaked, his hat pulled low over his eyes. Jake, who was refilling coffee cups, hesitated before finally making a decision. Today, he was going to ask. He walked over, holding the coffee pot, and cleared his throat. "Mr. Hughes, can I get you anything else today?" Walter looked up, his deep, pale blue eyes scanning Jake's face like he was searching for something. Then, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke. "Do you know what today is?" Jake frowned. It was just a regular Thursday. Nothing special. Walter exhaled, almost as if he had been expecting that answer. Then, for the first time in years, he did something Jake never thought he would. He gestured to the empty seat across from him. "Would you like to sit down, son?" Jake wasn't sure what surprised him more, the invitation or the fact that Walter called him son. But something in the old man's voice made it impossible to refuse. Slowly, he slid into the seat across from Walter, feeling an odd weight settle in the air between them. Walter took a sip of his black coffee, staring down at his untouched plate. Then, in a voice softer than a whisper, he said, 74 years ago today, my best friend died in my arms." Jake felt a chill crawl down his spine. Walter's fingers tapped against the table, his gaze distant, lost in time. "His name was James Holloway," he continued, as if he had been waiting decades for someone to listen. "We were kids when we went to war, barely 20, fresh-faced and stupid. We thought we were invincible." Jake didn't speak, afraid that even the smallest interruption would shatter the fragile moment. "It was a cold morning, just like today. We had been in the trenches for weeks. No sleep, no warm food, just the sound of gunfire and men screaming. James," Walter's voice cracked. "James was always the brave one. Always the one who joked about how we'd grow old, sit in a diner like this, and talk about the good old days." Walter inhaled shakily, his old hands balling into weak fists. Then came the ambush. A dozen of us caught in the open. Machine gun fire everywhere. His throat bobbed. "I got hit in the shoulder. But James, he didn't make it." A silence stretched between them, thick with ghosts of the past. Before he left the world, he grabbed my arm and made me promise something. Jake leaned in, his pulse thrumming. He said, "Eat one meal for me every day. Don't let me be forgotten." The words hit Jake like a punch to the gut. This wasn't just a routine. It wasn't just an old man stuck in his ways. This was a promise made over a dying friend's body, sealed in sacrifices. Walter exhaled sharply, his eyes glistening with something between grief and defiance. "I've been keeping that promise for 74 years. Jake felt his chest tighten. Walter wasn't just a lonely old man. He was a living piece of history. A forgotten hero. And no one knew. But before he could find the right words to respond, the door swung open violently. A man in a sleek suit entered, his sharp eyes scanning the diner before settling on Walter. Something about his presence felt wrong. Walter, who had been lost in memory, suddenly stiffened. His hands gripped the table, his knuckles turning white. Jake could see it, the flicker of fear in his eyes. The man smirked. Well, I finally found you, Sergeant Hughes." Jake's stomach dropped. Who was this man? Why did Walter look like he had just seen a ghost? And most importantly, what had Walter been hiding all these years? Walter swallowed hard. His knuckles were white as he gripped the edge of the table. "You've got the wrong man," he said, his voice tight. But the man chuckled, stepping forward. "I don't think I do, Sergeant." Jake's gut twisted. Sergeant? Walter had never mentioned his rank before. He had only spoken about James, about the war, but never about himself. The diner was empty except for the three of them. The tension was suffocating. Jake felt something dark lurking beneath the surface, something bigger than an old war story. "Who are you?" Jake asked, his voice firm. The man barely glanced at him. "Just someone looking for the truth." His eyes flicked back to Walter. "And I think it's time we talk, old man." Walter exhaled sharply, running a trembling hand through his thinning gray hair. His shoulders sank, but there was something else in his expression now, resignation. "Sit down," Walter said quietly. "You've been looking for me a long time. Might as well hear what you came for." Jake's heartbeat pounded as the man slid into the booth across from Walter. He remained standing, arms crossed, unwilling to let this stranger take control. The man placed his hands on the table, fingers interlocked. "I work for a private research firm," he began. "We dig up old war records, unsolved cases, things most people would rather stay buried. And your name, Sergeant Hughes, keeps showing up in places it shouldn't." Walter let out a humorless chuckle. "Should have burned those damn files when I had the chance." Jake felt like he was standing on the edge of a cliff, waiting for a gust of wind to send him over. The man reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a yellowed, folded document. He placed it on the table, tapping it with 2 fingers. "You were in the 45th Infantry Division, correct?" Walter didn't answer. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes was enough. The man continued. "There was a classified mission, something buried deep in records. Something about a group of American soldiers cut off behind enemy lines, presumed dead." Jake's breath caught. Walter's hand twitched. He stared at the paper like it was radioactive. "But you weren't dead, were you?" the man pressed. "You were captured." A sharp silence fell over the diner. Jake blinked. "Captured?" Walter's voice, when it came, was like gravel scraping against pavement. "I don't talk about those days." The man smirked. "That's the problem, Sergeant. Nobody does." Jake looked between them, his stomach twisting into knots. Captured. Walter had spent decades eating alone, keeping a promise to a dead friend. But now, a secret, one that had remained buried for almost 75 years, was clawing its way to the surface. Walter finally reached for the paper. His hands, though old and fragile, unfolded it with eerie precision. His eyes scanned the document, and for a moment, Jake swore he saw his lips tremble. "You're looking in the wrong place," Walter muttered. "The real story isn't in the records." The man's smirk faltered. "Then where is it?" Walter exhaled slowly, pressing his fingers against his temple. In the ground, he murmured. With the men who never came back. Jake's breath hitched. The men who never came back. Walter leaned forward, lowering his voice. There were 7 of us when we got captured. He looked the man dead in the eye. Only one made it out. The words sent a chill through Jake's spine. You, the man guessed. Walter nodded. Jake felt his stomach turn. He had spent years watching this man eat in silence, honoring the dead. And yet not once did he realize Walter wasn't just mourning James. He was mourning all of them. Walter's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was steady, like a man who had lived long enough with his ghosts. We were taken to an outpost deep in enemy territory, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. They didn't see us as prisoners. They saw us as leverage. Jake's mouth was dry. Leverage for what? Walter's gaze darkened. Information. The man in the suit leaned in. What kind of information? Walter hesitated for the first time. Jake saw it, the flicker of something dangerous. Walter's fingers tapped against the table, like a man weighing his next words carefully. Let's just say, we knew things we shouldn't have. Jake's skin prickled. The way Walter said it wasn't vague. It was intentional. They tried to break us. Walter continued. One by one, they picked us apart. He exhaled shakily. James was the first to go. Jake felt a lump in his throat. He had always assumed James had died in battle. But he hadn't. He had died as a prisoner. Walter's jaw clenched. They wanted me to talk. To give up positions, names, strategies. I refused. Jake didn't realize he was gripping the counter until his knuckles turned white. Walter exhaled. So they made me watch as they executed the others. The silence was deafening. Walter's voice was a whisper now, heavy with an agony that time had never erased. One by one they fell. Jake felt something break inside him. The man in the suit broke the silence. But you escaped. Walter's expression turned to stone. No. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Walter finally looked up, his eyes tired, haunted. I didn't escape, he admitted. I was let go. Jake's stomach twisted. Why? Walter stared at him for a long time before finally whispering. Because I made a deal. Jake's blood turned cold. The man in the suit stiffened. What kind of deal? Walter exhaled. One that should have died with me. Jake felt his hands shake. He didn't want to know the answer. But the words still came out. What did you give them? Walter looked down at his hands. Then, after what felt like a lifetime, he whispered. A name. Jake's world tilted. A name? Walter closed his eyes. And I've been paying for it ever since. The man in the suit, his expression unreadable, tapped his fingers on the table. Whose name did you give, Sergeant? Walter exhaled shakily. His hands, wrinkled and frail, clenched into fists. Jake wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. His name was Thomas Caldwell. The name hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake felt his stomach twist. He didn't know the name, but the way Walter said it, as if it had been haunting him every single day of his life, made it clear. This wasn't just a name. This was a betrayal. Walter's fingers trembled as he wiped a bead of sweat from his brow. His voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. Tommy was a kid, he said, his eyes distant, lost in a past only he could see. Just turned 19. Fresh out of training. He was the best of us, quick, sharp, fearless. The man in the suit leaned in, his expression dark. And you handed him over? Walter's jaw tightened. I didn't have a choice. Jake clenched his fists. You always have a choice. Walter's gaze snapped to his old, tired eyes suddenly burning with something fierce. Do you think I don't know that? He growled. Do you think I haven't spent every damn day of my life remembering what I did? Jake swallowed hard. Walter inhaled sharply, his voice breaking. They told me if I gave them one name, just one, they'd let me go. I didn't believe them, but I was starving, beaten, barely alive. He squeezed his eyes shut. And then they put a gun to my head. Jake's breath hitched. I wanted to die. I was ready. But then, Walter's voice trailed off, his fingers tightening around the table. Jake watched as something flickered in the old man's expression. Guilt, regret, something even deeper. Walter shook his head. Then they said they'd shoot someone else instead. One of the others. A sick realization settled in Jake's stomach. They hadn't threatened to finish him. They had threatened to kill someone else. Walter let out a breath so shaky it barely made a sound. I thought, if I gave them Tommy's name, maybe they'd keep their word. Maybe they'd spare him, just use him for information, let him go. He looked down at his hands. I was wrong. Silence fell over the diner. Jake could hear the distant sound of a car driving through a puddle, the hum of the refrigerator behind the counter. But inside, his chest felt tight. Walter Hughes had spent his entire life honoring a promise to his best friend. But all along, he had been running from a different promise. A promise he had broken. The man in the suit, whoever he was, seemed to already know what had happened next. Caldwell never made it out, he said flatly. Walter swallowed hard. No. Jake exhaled sharply, his stomach in knots. So you lived? And he died. Walter's expression twisted in pain. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Then, the man in the suit reached into his pocket, pulling out another folded document. He slid it across the table. Walter stared at it, but didn't move. That's his file, the man said. Thomas Caldwell. Officially listed as missing in action. Walter's hands twitched, but he didn't pick it up. I already know what it says. Jake's voice came out tight. Then why haven't you done anything about it? Walter looked up sharply. What do you think I've been doing all these years, Jake? His voice was hoarse, raw. You think I eat alone because I want to? You think I keep James' promise because I enjoy remembering that day? Jake didn't speak. Walter's eyes glistened. Every meal I eat, every bite, is a punishment. A reminder. James made me promise to eat for him. He exhaled shakily. But I also eat for Tommy. For the others. For the men who didn't make it. Jake's throat felt dry. Walter wasn't just fulfilling a promise. He was atoning. The man in the suit tapped the file. We've spent years trying to uncover what really happened to Caldwell. He exhaled. And we finally did. Walter froze. Jake's heartbeat picked up. What do you mean? Walter asked, his voice barely audible. The man hesitated. Then, he leaned forward. He didn't die in that camp, Sergeant. Walter's breath hitched. Jake felt his entire world tilt. What? Walter whispered. The man's expression hardened. Caldwell escaped. The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Jake blinked. He made it out? Walter's hands trembled. No, he shook his head. That's not possible. They finished him. The man in the suit smirked. That's what they wanted you to think. Jake saw Walter's face go pale. He survived, Sergeant. The man's voice was firm. But he didn't come home. Walter's breathing was uneven. Then where is he? The man sat back, watching him closely. That's the real question, isn't it? Jake's mind spun. All this time, Walter had thought he was responsible for a friend's death. But Thomas Caldwell had lived. And now, 74 years later, someone was finally looking for him. Walter clenched his fists. Tell me everything you know. The man in the suit leaned in, his voice dropping to a whisper. We think he's still out there, Hughes. And he might not be alone. Walter sat frozen in the diner booth, his hands clenched into fists on the table. His knuckles were white, his breathing shallow. Jake had never seen the old man like this, shaken to his core. Thomas Caldwell was alive. Jake felt a cold shiver run down his spine as the man in the suit leaned forward, his voice slow and deliberate. We believe Caldwell escaped the camp after you left. But he didn't return to the U.S. He disappeared. Walter's voice was barely a whisper. Where did he go? The man exhaled. That's the thing. We don't know. Jake's stomach twisted. You don't know? The man shook his head. Not entirely. But we've traced his last known location to Argentina. 1954. Walter blinked. His fingers twitched against the table, old muscles tightening like steel cables. Jake processed the information, but none of it made sense. Why would Caldwell, an American soldier, be anywhere near Argentina? Jake's voice came out rough. Are you telling me he was with them? The man's expression was unreadable. We're telling you that for 70 years he stayed in the shadows. He didn't want to be found. And now we think we know why. Walter's throat bobbed. His voice cracked when he spoke. He thinks I betrayed him. The man in the suit slid another file across the table. Walter hesitated, then slowly opened it. Inside were grainy black and white photos. Some looked like surveillance shots, taken from a distance, a figure walking through a marketplace, another of a man in a worn-out trench coat outside a dimly lit cafe. And then, Jake saw the last photo. His stomach clenched. It was an older man, sitting on a bench, staring at the camera. His hair was thin and white, but his eyes, those cold, hardened eyes, still burned. Jake didn't need to ask. Thomas Caldwell was still alive. Walter stared at the photo for so long that Jake thought he had stopped breathing. Then, finally, he exhaled. He knows. The man nodded. We think so. Jake frowned. Knows what? Walter's voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of a lifetime of guilt. That I'm alive. That I was let go. He swallowed hard. That I gave them his name. Jake was still trying to make sense of it all. Caldwell had survived. Caldwell had vanished. Caldwell had avoided the world for decades. Why? And if he had been alive all these years, why had he never come back? Walter's fingers trembled as he turned another page in the file. His breath caught. It was another document. A declassified report. Jake leaned over his shoulder, scanning the words. Subject: Thomas Caldwell. Status: missing. Last known location: Argentina. Suspected connection to Operation Gladio. Jake frowned. Operation Gladio? What's that? The man in the suit glanced at him. An old covert network used after war. Some say it was meant to stop the spread of communism. Others say it was a way to protect certain war criminals. Jake felt his chest tighten. Are you saying Caldwell was working with them? Walter closed the file. His expression was unreadable. No, he exhaled. I think he was hunting them. Jake's heart pounded. If Caldwell had been hunting them, that meant... Walter nodded, as if reading his thoughts. He never left the war. The weight of it all pressed down on Jake. For years, Walter had been drowning in guilt, believing he had condemned his friend. But in reality, Caldwell had been alive and fighting a war that never ended. Jake could barely wrap his head around it. The missing soldier had become a ghost, a man hunting the very monsters who had tried to destroy him. Jake asked the question out loud. Walter's answer was quiet. Because he doesn't want to be found. The man in the suit sat back. We weren't sure what happened to Caldwell after the 1960s. But 2 weeks ago, we got a lead. Jake's pulse spiked. What kind of lead? The man hesitated before reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a yellowed envelope. Walter's breath caught. His fingers trembled as he reached for it. Jake saw the name written across the front in faded ink. Walter Hughes. Jake's stomach flipped. It was addressed to Walter. And the return sender? T. Caldwell. Jake's breath hitched. Caldwell had sent this. Walter's eyes flicked up to the man. Where did you get this? The man exhaled. A safe deposit box. It had been left untouched for over 40 years. Jake's skin prickled. Walter swallowed hard, then carefully tore open the envelope. Inside was a single piece of folded paper. He unfolded it with shaky hands. And then he read, Walter, you lived. I lived. But the war never ended for me. I know what you did. I know why. You made a choice to survive. I made a choice to disappear. I don't blame you anymore. But that doesn't mean I can come back. If you're reading this, I'm probably gone. But there's something you need to know. There's a reason they let you go. And it's not the reason you think. You were never the betrayer, Walter. You were the one who was betrayed. Find the truth. Before it finds you. Walter's hands trembled as he lowered the letter. His face was unreadable. Jake's pulse roared in his ears. What the hell does that mean? He breathed. Walter's jaw clenched. His voice was low, steady. It means we're not done yet. Walter sat motionless, the letter gripped tightly in his shaking hands. The weight of Caldwell's words pressed down on him like an unbearable force. The world seemed to narrow around him. The walls of the diner faded into the background. The hum of the refrigerator, the distant sound of rain, even Jake's sharp inhale, all of it disappeared under the roar of his own thoughts. 74 years. 74 years he had carried the guilt. Lived in self-imposed exile. Let the burden of betrayal eat away at him like rust on an old rifle. But now, in a few scribbled words, Caldwell had flipped his entire existence upside down. The man in the suit studied Walter closely, watching his reaction. This letter changes everything, he said. Walter exhaled slowly. Or maybe it just confirms what I've always feared. Jake frowned. What do you mean? Walter didn't answer right away. Instead, he carefully folded the letter, slipping it back into the envelope. Caldwell was right about one thing. He looked up, his blue eyes sharp, alive with a fire Jake had never seen before. There's a reason they let me go. The man in the suit leaned forward. You said they forced you to give a name. Walter nodded. They did. Jake hesitated. And that name was Caldwell. Walter exhaled sharply. That's what I thought. His jaw tightened. But what if I was wrong? Jake's stomach twisted. What are you saying? Walter's voice was like a blade cutting through the air. What if they already knew who Caldwell was before I said a damn word? The room fell silent. Jake felt a sick realization creeping over him. The man in the suit finally spoke. You're saying Caldwell was marked from the start? Walter's eyes darkened. I think someone in our own unit gave him up before we were even captured. Jake's blood ran cold. You think there was a traitor? Walter's voice was grim. I don't think. I know. Walter had spent decades assuming he had been the one to betray Caldwell. That it was his weakness, his survival instinct, that had led to his best friend's fate. But now, it was all wrong. The truth was darker. Someone had set them up. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. Do you remember anyone from your unit who seemed different? Someone who could have been working with the enemy? Walter's expression was unreadable. I don't have to guess. Jake inhaled sharply. You already know. Walter nodded, his fingers curling into a fist on the table. His voice was laced with quiet fury. His name was Captain Leonard Mason. The name rolled off Walter's tongue like something poisonous. The man in the suit reacted instantly. Mason? Are you sure? Walter let out a humorless laugh. I'd bet my life on it. Jake's skin prickled. Who was he? Walter's gaze darkened. Our commanding officer. Jake blinked. Wait, you think your own CO betrayed you? Walter exhaled sharply. I don't think. I know. The man in the suit frowned. Mason's war record is clean. He was a decorated officer. A war hero. Walter's eyes burned. Yeah? And that's exactly how you cover your tracks. Jake leaned in, his heartbeat pounding. What did Mason do? Walter clenched his fists. It was near the end of the war. We were stationed near the Ardennes, waiting for extraction. The fighting had died down, but the intelligence coming in told us something was off. The man in the suit listened intently. Go on. Walter's voice was steady, but there was an undercurrent of barely contained rage. We had orders to stay put. But Mason? He made a decision that didn't sit right with me. He told us we were moving forward. Deeper into enemy territory. Jake frowned. That doesn't make sense. Walter's lips pressed into a thin line. It made sense when we walked straight into an ambush. Jake felt his breath catch. You think he led you into it on purpose? Walter's eyes were cold. Probably. The man in the suit was silent for a moment. Then he nodded. That would explain why you were captured. They wanted information. Walter's jaw tightened. And I think Mason wanted to make sure Caldwell didn't leave that camp alive. Jake exhaled sharply. Why? What did Caldwell know? Walter's gaze was sharp, focused. That's what we need to find out. The man in the suit stood up. Mason's records are sealed, but if what you're saying is true, there's more buried beneath the official reports. Walter's voice was firm. Then it's time to start digging. Jake looked between them. Mason would be dead by now, right? The man in the suit smirked. Officially? Yes. Jake stiffened. And unofficially? The man shrugged. Let's just say, powerful men have a way of disappearing when the past starts catching up to them. Walter exhaled. Then we find him. Or we find whoever's still covering for him. Jake's hands tightened into fists. He had started this day thinking Walter was just an old man eating alone out of grief. Now, he realized, Walter Hughes was still a soldier. Still fighting. And for the first time in decades, he wasn't alone. Walter looked at Jake. You in? Jake didn't hesitate. Hell yes. Walter's eyes flicked to the man in the suit. Then let's finish what started 74 years ago. The man nodded. First stop? Finding out what happened to Leonard Mason. Walter stood up, his back straight despite his age. His voice was steady. Then let's go dig up a ghost. Walter Hughes hadn't felt this alive in years. For decades he had been a relic, just another forgotten veteran, spending his days in solitude, fulfilling a promise he thought was his only redemption. But now, he had a new purpose. Jake had never seen the old man move with such determination. Despite his frail body and thinning hair, there was steel in his spine as they stepped out of the diner, into a storm that had nothing to do with the rain. The man in the suit, who had finally introduced himself as Daniel Pierce, an independent investigator, led them into his car, the wipers struggling against the relentless downpour. Mason disappeared decades ago, Pierce explained as he navigated the wet roads. But some people are still keeping his name out of the records. That means one thing, he was part of something bigger. Walter exhaled sharply. Caldwell knew something they wanted buried. Pierce nodded. And you were meant to be collateral damage. Jake leaned forward from the back seat. So where do we start? Pierce tapped his fingers against the steering wheel. I pulled every file I could on Mason, and only one name kept showing up in connection with his disappearance. Richard Holloway. Walter stiffened. Holloway? Jake frowned. That name sounds familiar. Walter inhaled deeply. James Holloway. His voice was laced with something between pain and realization. My best friend. Jake's jaw clenched. You think they're related? Pierce smirked. Not just related. Richard Holloway is James' son. The words hit Walter like a bullet. For a moment, he just sat there, staring at Pierce. Then, his hand clenched into a fist on his lap. James had a son. A son who had unknowingly been hunting the same truth Walter had been avoiding for a lifetime. An hour later, they arrived at a small law office on the outskirts of town. The sign read Holloway and Associates. Walter's heart pounded in his chest. The doorbell chimed as they stepped inside, the scent of old paper and coffee filling the air. A receptionist looked up, frowning at the three rain-soaked figures. Can I help you? She asked. Pierce stepped forward. We're here to see Richard Holloway. The woman hesitated, then picked up a phone. Minutes later, a tall man with graying hair and sharp blue eyes stepped into the room. He looked to be in his early 60s, his face lined with the same kind of burden Walter carried in his own. Richard's eyes landed on Walter, and for a long, silent moment he simply stared. Then, softly, he said, I know who you are. Walter's throat tightened. Then you know why I'm here. Richard exhaled. I do. And I have something for you. Without another word, he turned and led them into his office. Richard reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a worn-out leather journal. He placed it on the table between them. This belonged to my father, he said, his voice steady. I only found it after my mother passed. Walter's fingers trembled as he picked up the journal. The moment he touched the leather, something inside him cracked. He slowly opened it. The handwriting was instantly familiar. James Holloway's words, written across the pages in faded ink. Jake and Pierce remained silent as Walter flipped through the entries, his breath coming in sharp gasps. Then he stopped. A passage had been underlined. Mason is compromised. I don't trust him. If something happens, tell Hughes to never stop looking. The truth is buried, but not forgotten. Walter inhaled sharply, his hands gripping the journal. James had known. He had known Mason was working with the enemy. And he had tried to warn Walter. Walter pressed a hand over his mouth, his eyes burning. James tried to protect me. Richard nodded. He did. And I think my father's death wasn't an accident. He got too close to something. Something big. Over the next few weeks, they pieced together the last fragments of the puzzle. Using old records, declassified intelligence, and contacts Pierce had in high places, they uncovered the final truth. Mason had been a double agent. He had leaked intelligence in exchange for power and wealth. When Caldwell had learned the truth, he had become a target. And Mason had orchestrated the ambush, ensuring Caldwell and the others never made it out alive. But Caldwell had survived. And Mason had spent decades covering his tracks. Pierce managed to track down one final lead, an offshore account still receiving payments. The money was tied to a man living under an alias in Spain. Leonard Mason. Jake clenched his jaw. He is still alive? Pierce smirked. Not for long. Walter exhaled. He had spent a lifetime believing he was the villain of his own story. Now, he had a chance to set things right. 3 months later, Leonard Mason was arrested in Madrid. The crimes buried under decades of corruption were finally dragged into the light. The world learned the truth. And Walter Hughes, the man who had once believed he was a traitor, became a hero. The media exploded with the revelation. His name was restored, his honor reinstated. But more than that, Walter had finally kept his promise. Not just to James. Not just to Caldwell. But to himself. The diner was packed. For the first time in years, Walter didn't sit alone. Jake placed a plate in front of him, a familiar meal. Meatloaf. Mashed potatoes. Cornbread. Black coffee. Walter smiled. They would have liked this. Jake grinned. Yeah, they would have. Pierce raised a glass. To the ghosts we carry. And the battles we still fight. Walter nodded, lifting his coffee. To the ones we never forget. And for the first time in 74 years. The meal didn't taste like guilt. It tasted like freedom. Like peace. Like home.